1794. The United States was on the edge of collapse, not because of foreign invasion, not because of war with Britain, but because of a tax. Farmers armed themselves, federal troops mobilized, and for the first time in American history, the government prepared to march against its own citizens. The cause: whiskey. The United States was barely a nation. The war for independence had been won, but the Republic was fragile, broke, divided, and in the hills of western Pennsylvania, farmers were preparing for war. Not against Britain, against their own government. The cause: whiskey. On the American frontier, grain meant survival: corn, rye, barley. But grain spoiled. It was heavy, and hauling it across mountains cost more than it was worth. So farmers adapted. They distilled it. Whiskey didn't rot. It traveled well. It held value. On the frontier, whiskey wasn't indulgence. It was currency. Barrels paid debts. Wages were settled in it. Even doctors prescribed it. In many regions, whiskey functioned as money, and then the federal government needed money of its own. After the Revolution, the United States was drowning in debt, war bonds, foreign loans, domestic pressure. The new Constitution had created power, but it had not created revenue. Someone had to pay. In 1791, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton proposed a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. On paper, it was brilliant. Whiskey was everywhere. It was easy to measure, and it would generate reliable income. But in western Pennsylvania, the tax felt different. Large distillers could afford it. Small farmers could not. Cash was scarce on the frontier. Most trade happened in goods, not coin. The tax required hard currency. Resentment spread quickly. Tax collectors were threatened. Some were beaten, others were tarred and feathered. Meetings turned into mobs. By 1794, resistance became organized. Armed militias gathered. Federal authority was openly defied. This became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. For the first time, the Constitution faced an internal test. Would federal law mean anything beyond paper? President George Washington made a decision no leader had made before. He mobilized nearly 13,000 militia troops. Then he did something unprecedented. He led them personally. The message was unmistakable. The federal government would enforce its laws, even against its own citizens. The rebellion dissolved before full-scale bloodshed erupted. Arrests were made, trials were held. Only 2 men were convicted of treason, and both were pardoned. But the precedent had been set. Federal authority had survived its first violent challenge, and it survived because of whiskey. The tax remained, and whiskey did not disappear. It expanded. Scottish and Irish immigrants carried distilling traditions into Kentucky and Tennessee. New techniques emerged. Charred oak barrels gave birth to bourbon. Regional identity formed around flavor. By the early 1800s, whiskey was no longer frontier currency. It was commercial enterprise. Railroads carried barrels across states. Warehouses multiplied. Brand names began to matter. By the late 19th century, distilling was industrial. Steam power replaced handcraft. Corporate consolidation replaced small producers. Whiskey had transformed from rebellion fuel to economic engine, but prosperity created visibility, and visibility created opposition. Temperance movements gained strength. Religious leaders condemned alcohol as moral decay. Political campaigns promised reform. By 1920, the United States banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol nationwide. Prohibition had begun. Distilleries closed, barrels were destroyed, warehouses were raided. The legal whiskey industry collapsed overnight, but demand did not collapse. It adapted. Speakeasies flourished in hidden basements. Bootleggers moved product across state lines. Smugglers built networks faster than lawmakers could dismantle them. Organized crime expanded into a national enterprise. In attempting to control alcohol, the government empowered criminals. Tax revenue vanished. Enforcement costs soared. Public opinion shifted. In 1933, Prohibition ended, not because alcohol disappeared, but because the state needed revenue. Again, whiskey returned, regulated, licensed, taxed. The cycle had completed itself, from currency, to rebellion, to industry, to criminalization, and back to taxation. Whiskey nearly fractured a young republic. It financed expansion, it built fortunes, it fueled crime. And every time power tried to suppress it, the spirit endured. Because whiskey was never just a drink, it was leverage. And in 1794, the United States learned something permanent. Control the bottle, or the bottle will test your control. The rebellion ended, but whiskey did not. It moved west, it moved into warehouses, and eventually it moved into names. Families turned distilling into legacy. In Kentucky, the Beam family refined bourbon into a national force. In Tennessee, Jack Daniel built a distillery that would become one of the most recognized spirits in the world. What began as frontier currency became global industry. By the 20th century, American whiskey was no longer a regional product. It was an export, a symbol of industry, of resilience, of American power. And the lesson remained unchanged. Control the bottle, and you influence the nation. But whiskey was only one chapter, because while the young United States fought over taxation, across the Atlantic, another spirit was funding empires, fueling ships, and shaping the Atlantic slave trade. That story begins next.